Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear, Catriona.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Can everyone see my slides?
Beautifully.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction. My name's, well, it's Catriona Jones, but I do answer to Catriona as well, so don't worry about that. I answer to a lot of things, different versions of my name, but yes, I'm known as Catriona Jones, and I am a midwifery lecturer at University of York. Now, I did have these slides on properly branded University of York slides, but when I sent them over to Frida on Friday, all the formatting went off, so I've had to reload them onto boring plain white PowerPoint slides. I do apologise for that. The other thing is my presentation is quite long, but the reason for that is because I'm going to be talking about my PhD findings, and it's really difficult to work out what to take out. I find it all really fascinating. Hopefully you'll find it fascinating as well, but there was a lot to try and condense into half an hour, so let's see if I can do that. A little bit of background about myself and my work. I am a midwifery lecturer, so I'm a midwife by background. I've worked in higher education now for 20 years, so I came into a lecturing role in 2004. And at some point during my 20 years, I took a period of time to have a secondment into a research role. And within that research role, I was given the opportunity to undertake my PhD. Now, I was a research fellow in maternal and reproductive health. And it was during that time that I stumbled across asexuality and asexual self-identity. And I recognised that this was an area that was particularly interesting, both clinically and from a research perspective, so academically as well. And it was through that undertaking that role, that research fellow role in maternal and reproductive health, that I was given the possibility of the opportunity of undertaking my PhD on asexuality. There's a bit of a longer story behind that, but I won't go into it. When I first started out with my PhD, I had these assumptions about what asexuality was. And I think those assumptions are probably similar to what most people assume about it. But coming out of it on the other side, I've recognised that it's a lot more complex than I originally assumed, and a lot more interesting as well. And the asexual community are a very diverse community, which you will realise throughout this presentation. So my PhD I undertook it between 2014 and 2020. The title of it is Transcending Sexualisation, a constructivist grounded theory of asexual self-identity. So my overarching research question was, what are the social processes that inform asexual self-identity? And I had a number of other questions within my work which I attempted to answer around how asexuals define their own identity, the processes that inform the identity development, how the identity impacts upon relationships with others, and also I wanted to try and find out or explore a little bit about the health and well-being of people who identify as asexual. So each one of those smaller questions I'm going to deal with on a separate slide as we get towards the end of the presentation. So just a bit of background really about asexuality, and this may be where some of you are in terms of your understanding of it. It's most commonly understood and defined as lacking sexual attraction, an absence of sexual attraction, or low levels of sexual attraction and desire. So across the sort of popular literature, it is associated with lower levels of sexual attraction and sexual desire. And I'll return to that conversation on slide 24. The backstory of asexuality is that Alfred Kinsey identified, and through his work, he identified an element of possible sexual behaviour that was suggestive of altered levels of attraction. And this was in the work he undertook around trying to understand same populations of same-sex attraction and opposite-sex attraction. So through that work, he was able to identify there were a group of individuals who answered a question which was suggestive of feeling no levels of sexual attraction. And he labelled that group as Group X. And you'll see it on the Kinsey scale. There's a specific Group X, which he identifies as having altered levels of sexual attraction. There was no further exploration of that particular demographic until 2004. And they were sort of lost somewhere. Nobody seemed particularly interested in people that identified themselves as not feeling sexual attraction. Possibly they just weren't, it wasn't an area worth exploration. And so they sort of got lost in history, really, until 2004, when along came Anthony Bogart, who did some secondary data analysis on a national probability sample around sexual behaviour. And what Bogart recognised was, again, that there was a group of individuals within that data who reported feeling no sexual attraction to others, and Bogart labelled them as asexual. So they didn't identify themselves as asexual. He sort of pulled that data out and gave them that label. And at that point, he's published a paper on this in 2004. And this label is asexual. This topic of asexuality seemed to gain more interest in academic fields. So why bother looking at individuals who claim to feel no levels of sexual attraction? That seems to be, historically, this group seem to not be particularly interesting in terms of sexuality and sexual health. So, but as Bogart recognised this group and interest in them started to rise, it became clear that asexuality as an identity was barely intelligible. So people could not wrap their heads around this concept of somebody, an individual, not experiencing sexual attraction or sexual desire. I think one of the things that somebody said to me once when I identified that I was studying this as part of my PhD, I think somebody once said to me, is asexuality, is that actually a thing? And that's the sort of comments that I was met with initially when I started to do this work. So people who identify as ace, because that's the shortened version of asexuality, people who identify as ace do experience discrimination and stigmatisation. There is a small body of literature to suggest that, and certainly my research was able to identify as that as well. In some LGBT circles, asexuality has struggled to gain acceptance, almost to the point where it seems that belonging to a same-sex identity is more acceptable than having identifying as asexual. So, because if you're part of a same-sex identity, the thinking is, well, at least you're sexual. However, if you are part of a asexual identity, or if you're part of an asexual community, it's really not clearly understood how anybody could actually not have any feelings of sexual desire, no feelings of sexual attraction, and no sort of impetus around being in a sexual relationship. So there were calls from academic and the asexual community for greater visibility and a greater understanding about asexuality and about asexual self-identity, certainly around about the time that I started to undertake my PhD. And this is an example of some of the things that people say to people who identify as asexual. This was taken from the Asexuality Visibility Education Network. So these are some of the comments that self-identified asexuals have experienced from other people. I'll just let you have a moment to read through those. So in terms of the quantitative work that has previously been undertaken around trying to understand levels of sexual attraction and sexual desire, there has been work done in around about 2007 to 2014, trying to measure desire, arousal, and inhibition and sexual functioning, and try and, in some literature, try and sort of find out whether that relates to levels of distress or not. So Prosen, Graham and Brotto had some interesting findings around that. They sought to measure desire, arousal, orientation and inhibition. And they found through their research that some people who identify as asexual do actually feel sexual attraction to men and women. They used quantitative data to suggest that asexuality is not a disorder of sexual arousal, because there have been incidences in the past where asexuality has been considered to be some sort of disorder, or it has been linked or associated with pathology. And then in 2014, research suggests that some people who identify as asexual are more likely to have relationships that do not involve sexual activity than non-asexuals. And people with hyposexual desire disorder share a similar disinterest in sexual activity. So it's a really confusing picture. And I think that slide just highlights, so you have this popular literature which talks about experiencing no levels and low levels of desire and attraction, and then you have some quantitative work that suggests that's not the case. So you can understand why, and as an identity, it is shrouded in misunderstanding, and there is still not a great deal of understanding across the general public about how asexuality or how that identity is operationalized on a sort of daily basis for self-identified asexuals. In more recent work that I did a quick sort of scout of the internet a few days ago, and more recent work is still sort of hanging itself on this idea that it's about, that asexuality is all about sexual attraction and sexual desire. But more recent work has identified that it's beginning to be able to untangle itself from this medical stigma, from pathology, and it is beginning to be understood more widely as an identity in its own right. But there's still a lot of literature out there which links it to attraction and desire, which might not be wrong. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I have discovered through my own research that actually there are alternative ways of us trying to understand asexuality, to the point where it doesn't render those who identify as asexual as being some sort of vulnerable outsider who's on the margins of some wonderful, sexy thing that's going on. So I think some of the work that I've done in the past and that I'm trying to do now is around getting people to rethink this notion of asexuality and its links to sexual desire and sexual attraction, because it is so much more than that. So I undertook qualitative research. I interviewed 21 self-identified asexuals. I recruited them through a number of online forums and through local and regional LGBTQIA networks. My criteria for being part of the research, I didn't have any strict criteria other than people who embraced an asexual identity. And they had to be 18 and over and sufficiently fluent in English. So the age range of my sample was 18 to 65. All but 2 of the participants identified as male or female. The sample were from a mixed population from the UK, France, Germany, Brazil, and the United States. I used selective sampling approaches at later stages to gain a more diverse population, including more males and more people of colour. However, I was unable to recruit anyone from Black, Asian and minoritized ethnic community. The interviews were, 3 of the interviews were face-to-face, 2, face-to-face, 2 were telephone and 16 via Skype. I used constructivist grounded theory. I also used Bourdieusian social theory. So I looked at the work of Pierre Bourdieu and I looked at his work around theory of practice and the logic of practice as a way to try and understand the societal structures and how my participants interacted with those societal structures whilst they were trying to discover their identity, whilst they were trying to find themselves. So I used these concepts of habitus, capital, field and practice to explore the social processes. And I looked at certain sort of societal structures like religion, patriarchy, medicine, can't remember, sexuality, to help sort of shine some light on how my participants were able to transcend this sort of sexualized world which revealed itself throughout the data, and to help try and uncover really the kind of key obstacles that they faced in their journey towards finding an asexual identity. At the end of my analysis, I came up with this, I call it this asexual self-identity model. And although it looks quite complicated there, it's fairly straightforward in as much as my core category was transcending sexualization to fulfill a need to belong. And what I recognised was of the 21 participants, they went through a journey. It wasn't always linear. But part of that, each part of the journey involved a stage of becoming, a stage of resolution, and then a stage of consolidation. So the becoming stage tends to be when participants were trying to understand themselves within a sexualized world. So they hadn't yet come across this term asexuality or asexual, but they were trying to understand what was different about them compared to their peers. They were interacting with others, some of them as early as age 6, 7, or they were trying to understand why when people said things like, oh, is that your boyfriend or is that your girlfriend? Oh, do you fancy them? Why that just meant nothing to them, and they had no real sort of acknowledgement of what that meant or what it might mean. So within that becoming stage, there was quite a lot of very innocent interactions for some of them in their early school years, which people were assuming were more than that, and they just drew a blank with those. So that I felt as if that sort of really fitted well with this idea of assimilating. They were assimilating knowledge about themselves and about other people and about how other people were interpreting their interactions with others. But during that time, they were also connecting with lots of other people. And it was their connections with other people that were leading them to start wondering what was wrong with them, if there was something wrong with them, because they didn't think and feel the same way as everyone else. And then for many of my participants, they experienced something that I called a situational bind, was when they were in a situation where something sexual was going on around them, and there was an expectation that they were going to be involved in that, but whatever it was they were being expected to be part of or being expected to do, it kind of went against something very deep within them, and they felt extremely uncomfortable. So they wanted to connect with this group of people or this one person on a specific level, but they didn't want to connect with them on the level that the other people expected them to, and that level invariably was on a sexual level. So many of them, all of them, experienced a situational bind, and it was that situational bind that forced them into either having to go off into this resolution stage or to reframe their experience and put it down to something like, oh, well, I just haven't matured enough yet to be thinking about relationships or intimacy, or oh, maybe I'm just maybe I'm gay actually, maybe that's what I need to do, maybe I need to rethink my sexual identity. So for quite a number of them, after the situational bind, they reframed their experience and they went back into the becoming stage again. But for a number of my participants, they went through the situational bind and went on into this stage of resolution, I call it, where they disengage from all sorts of activities like dating, anything sexual, they disengage from whatsoever, and they start searching for explanations as to what was going on within that situational bind. Some of them, during that search for explanations, contemplate asexuality. And they completely dismiss it, in which case they go back into reframing. And some of them contemplate asexuality and they move on to the consolidation stage. Now, the contemplation of asexuality was normally around Googling, going online, trying to understand why they didn't feel sexual attraction, and then being taken to an online community like the Asexuality Visibility Education Network, and then landing on this network and going, oh my goodness, this is me, this is my experience, this is what I've been waiting for, this is what I've been looking for. And from that consolidation stage, they then go on to understand their identity a lot clearer. They then start to understand the world as being very sexualized. They start critiquing the sexualized world. They critique sexuality, and that helps them to make greater sense of what they're all about and what the sexualized world is all about. And then eventually they come out of this, many of them, most of them, identifying as, I call it essentially asexual. Many of them go back into reframing as well, or they went back into reframing numerous times, and they had to go through the stages again before they came out the other side. So that's just a bit of a very short journey, a whistle-stop tour of my self-identity model. And obviously I had to pick out little bits to put into this PowerPoint, but it's so much bigger than the summarised version I've given you now, and I'm always happy to talk about it in more detail to anybody that wants to talk to me about it. But they are the key elements of the model, and they are the key elements of the journey that my participants made in order to be able to self-identify comfortably as asexual at the end of it. So the implications for practice were, for me, were that relationship education as well as relationship and sex education should be directed towards encouraging a culture that values lasting, positive and significant interpersonal relationships with or without sexual behaviour. Alternative models of relationship formation that are not intrinsically bound to sexual attraction do exist. And relationship education should encourage individuals to think more broadly about relationships and how they could be constructed in more meaningful ways. Because what anchored all the data from all my participants was this need to belong. And my core category is transcending sexualization, the social processes that help asexuals find the need to belong, because the need to belong is central to the asexual experience, far more central to it, I would argue, than lowered levels of sexual attraction. So belongingness theory, which is what I talk about in my PhD, is a much stronger lens through which you can look at asexuality and look at asexual relationships, rather than the whole sexual attraction theory, sexual desire. I've included this quote here from one of my participants: non-binary, co-romantic, co-sexual. Please nobody ask me what that is, because I can't remember now what that identity actually is. It's something around being unsure yet whether one experiences romantic attraction or not. So what Alex was saying was, it's not that you're missing anything, it's just that there are other ways to connect, and you have to relearn the value of those connections. Identifying as asexual is you saying, I have these other ways of connecting with people, and they are just as valid to me, as if not more valid than a sexual relationship. It's just that plenty of asexual people have sex all the time. It doesn't mean people are not asexual. It just means that they're not actually having a model of sexual attraction to another person in order to have that sex. And there's another one of my participants, Sharon, who talked about how being asexual felt for her. It's like, I don't have the sexual scripts. They are not innate in me, but eventually I've learned them. So I do have them as a concept, so that now if I'm having a conversation, how I should behave, because I've learnt them, but I just don't feel them naturally in me. I am capable of being sexual. It's just that it wasn't innate. So it is artificial in a way, but at least I know. I had to learn that to function in society, and so that's it. So those 4 questions that I talked about at the beginning, I'm just going to touch on these for now. So how do asexuals define their identity? So for the participants in my work, they define their identity through I called it weak social construction theory, where they believe themselves to be born asexual, but at the same time that they recognise this sort of fluidity of sexuality, but they were absolutely adamant that they were born this way. They were born asexual. So yeah, so I called it weak social construction. They consider themselves as born this way. This gave rise to the category within the asexual self-identity theory as essentially asexual. And for the participants in this study, definitions of asexuality were informed by the repeated themes within their life stories. And those themes were about patterns of struggles to negotiate sexuality from a very early age, the distinctive and preferred asexual features of their closest and most intimate relationships, and those were a constant within their stories. In terms of how their identity impacts on their relationships with others, they had to consider very carefully about disclosure. The data suggested that their experiences of transcending the sexualised world existed within a framework of societal heterosexism, where heterosexism seemed to privilege heterosexuality and stigmatise, but to an extent tolerate other sexual behaviours. But it failed to accommodate non-sexual behaviours and practices in affectionate relationships. So they had to be very, very careful about how they identified themselves to others because of that failure of heterosexism to accommodate non-sexual behaviours. They talked about this, well, I've called it an anticipated hostility. I've seen that in previous LGBT work. So they anticipate people being not having any understanding of the identity and immediately sort of defaulting to, oh, there must be something wrong with you. So there's an anticipated hostility. They were reluctant to disclose their identity to close friends, and almost as if it felt for them that they would be accepted as long as they belonged to a sexual identity, irrespective of what that identity was. That seemed to be more acceptable than being than identifying as asexual. And yeah, believed family members would be more accepting of non-heterosexual identity rather than an asexual one. In terms of mental health and well-being, and this is something probably that you guys might be more interested in. I published a paper from my literature review, and the findings from that literature review did identify the importance of understanding asexuality in clinical settings, and there's some work in there around mental health and well-being. And so that paper can be found on that link. Identifying as asexual meant that the participants became embedded within a phenomenon of contrasting experiences, from reassurance and satisfaction to stress and anxiety, and equally, the decision to hide one's asexual identity was also very stressful for participants. 4 participants disclosed that they'd sought therapy through either counselling or a psychologist during the process of becoming in resolution. 5 disclosed that they'd suffered with and had been treated for depression. 4 identified depressive symptoms which predated their consolidation stage. 3 were treated for depressive symptoms pre-consolidation stage. 2 identified that mental ill health became a feature in their lives after they identified as asexual. And the mechanisms of the relationship between self-identity and mental health and well-being in terms of cause and consequence were really unclear in my work, but that's an area that my work couldn't shine any further light on, but I guess it identifies an area for further research. But what was clear was that around 38% of the sample had identified engagement with psychology, counselling and or antidepressant medication. And I've just added that given this finding, the emotional well-being of people who identify with an asexual narrative should be a matter of concern for all of us and does warrant further exploration. A little bit there about attraction and desire. This is slide 24 that I talked about at the start. So theories of belonging, for me, provided greater insight into the self-identity and the construction of it. Far greater insight than theories of sexual attraction. And it felt like this work was a step towards asexuality being understood as something that is more suited to being explored through the lens of connecting, belonging, and forming lasting, positive, significant interpersonal relationships. And my participants throughout this work alluded to the importance of the formation of social bonds and connections, not only in terms of how connecting helped them to start questioning themselves around this sexual sort of world that they lived in, but also in terms of how connecting with others helped them to consolidate their identity as asexual. So at the end of their journey to becoming, adopting that identity, they demonstrated this sort of preparedness to wrestle for a recognition of the value of relationships that weren't based on sexual attraction and intimacy. They recognised that through society and through their journey, there exists a culture of a supremacy of sexuality. And they arrived at a place where they selectively engaged with the struggle to fulfill a sense of belonging rather than stepping aside from it and disengaging, which is what they did between becoming and resolution. They stepped aside. And data suggested that the participants were able to impose their own asexual values, language, and ways of behaving in relationships upon the supremacy of sexuality. I'm not going to spend too long on that. Oh yes, so this was my take-home points for anyone that's interested. How to work inclusively with people who identify as asexual, have some understanding of what it means to identify as asexual. So hopefully my presentation has given you some of that. Respect the choices being made within that identity. You'll see that some of my data suggests that people who identify as asexual do actually engage in sexual relationships. So it's about respecting people's choices around that. Being aware of the barriers to healthcare. So anecdotal evidence taken from the AVEN community suggests that a number of people who self-identify as asexual choose not to disclose their identity to healthcare professionals through fear of them being pathologised, problematised or judged. And remember that the term asexuality is an umbrella term, and behind that label there are a multitude of different other identities, like in terms of how people experience sex, romance, friendship and intimacy. So there's grey asexual, there's demi-asexual, there's biromantic, aromantic, co-romantic. So, and you don't need to know them all. You just need to understand that when somebody identifies as asexual, there's a whole sort of diversity of potential identities beneath that, and it might be helpful to explore what specific identity they can most relate to within that umbrella term. So don't be afraid to ask those questions. And there's my references, and that is my presentation.
Wow, Catriona. That was quite a walkthrough, lots of information there. Very, very detailed, and I think people have lots of food for thought there possible it's something that we maybe haven't really given that much thought to, or maybe I'll use I statements here, my misperceptions possibly is more accurate. I think, or you think you know something, but you've switched on some lights and some more stuff that I'll need to reflect on. I think take-home message for me is about use of language and understanding of what it means from the perspective of the individual. And I think you've kind of shone that spotlight on it means something different for everybody. In terms of other work that people have done similar to yours, is there anywhere else that you would highlight as leaders in this field?
That's a really good question, Michael. So there are not lots of, I would say there's a gentleman called Mark Carrigan, and he's written quite a lot. Now, I can't remember, he's an academic, but I can't remember which university he's at. He's based in the UK, so I would say Mark Carrigan has written a lot about asexuality. I would, and of course, the Asexuality Visibility Education Network. I know it's an asexual community, but there's so much information on there and loads of links to grey literature. And that's often a really good place to go to.
Yes.
So yeah, I would say start off looking at the work of Mark Carrigan and then have a look about on Aven. The other thing I would say is as well, and I'm aware that I'm talking too much now, is that I was doing a presentation just last week to my second year student midwives about sexual health. And I often drop things into the conversation with them about asexuality and say, right, okay, so we know about sexual health, but do you think the concept of sexual health incorporates asexuality? And so I get them thinking about asexuality through the lens of sexuality. So whenever I'm talking about sexuality in class, I always bring in asexuality. And I don't have the answers to a lot of what the things that I'm throwing out there to them, but I'm just planting seeds and getting them to think beyond sexual and think into the asexual. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there as well to get anybody else who's thinking about how they start discussions with their students, is just to, whenever they're talking about sexual, always talk about asexual as well.
So what did the student midwives make of that concept then? Was it one that they were familiar with?
Well, yes, because I'm always banging on about it because it's my PhD. But if it wasn't for me banging on about it, it would not be anywhere on the radar. And we did have a really interesting debate about whether the concept of sexual health does actually already include asexuals, whether it's inclusive of asexuality or whether it's not. And we had a really interesting debate about it. So yeah. So yes, Michael, sorry, to answer your question, yeah, they know about it because I'm talking about it to them quite a lot, but otherwise they wouldn't do it. It would not be on their radar.
Yes. So this again is an emerging issue for the curriculum for nursing and midwifery and other students. Is maybe something, again, one of the take-home messages, how we start to weave this in as a bit of a concept or raise awareness of it, about how people define themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
I think so. Okay, well, thank you very much, Catriona from Ayrshire. I trained in Stop Hill, and we've got Fiona Hollins-Martin that trained in Ayrshire as well. So
well,
I don't know if you trained in Ayrshire, but
Caroline was one of my lecturers when I was a student midwife, so I was just a little bit nervous just presenting in front of my lecturers 25 years down the line, but she's also a very good friend as well.
Caroline Hollins-Martin's a wee kitten. Just a wee pussy cat there.
I'll start purring.
Fabulous.
No, well
Thank
done, Cleo. That
much.
was great. That was really good
Really
study, and you've captured it really well.
You know, and hopefully, Catriona, here for people, it's shining a light on something that maybe they've not thought about or feel a bit lacking in knowledge about. So that's what today is partly about. There's nothing that we can't talk about. And if people do one or two things differently from what they did this time last year, then that is progress, and that's really what we're about. So a huge thank you to you, and you've come in time perfectly. So thank you very much. I'm always grateful for that.
Cheers.
So we're going to move on now into our last presenter.